Come Out of the Wilderness by James Baldwin. Paul did not yet feel her eyes on him. She watched him. He went to the window, peering out between the slats in the Venetian blinds. She could tell from his profile that it did not look like a pleasant day. In profile, all of the contradictions that so confounded her seemed to be revealed. He had a boy's long, rather thin neck, but it supported a head that seemed even more massive than it actually was because of its plantation of thickly curling black hair that was always a little too long, or else, cruelly, much too short. His forehead was broad and high, but this austerity was contradicted by a short, blunt, almost ludicrously upturned nose. And he had a large mouth and very heavy, sensual lips, which suggested a certain wry cruelty when turned down, but looked like the mask of comedy when he laughed. His body was really excessively black with hair, which proved, she said, since Negroes were generally less hairy than whites, which race, in fact, had moved farthest from the ape. Other people did not see his beauty, which always mildly astonished her. It was like thinking that the sun was ordinary. He was sloppy about the way he stood and sat, that was true, and so his shoulders were already beginning to be round. And he was a poor man's son, a city boy, and so his body could not really remind anyone of a Michelangelo statue, as she, fantastically, he said, claimed. It did not have that luxury or that power. It was economically tense and hard, and testified only to the agility of the poor, who are always dancing one step ahead of the devil. He stepped away from the window, looking worried. Ruth closed her eyes. When she opened them, he was disappearing away from her down the short black hall that led to the bathroom. She wondered what time he had come in last night. She wondered if he had a hangover. She heard the water running. She thought that he had probably not been home long. She was very sensitive to his comings and goings, and had often found herself abruptly upright and wide awake a moment after he, restless at 2:30 in the morning, had closed the door behind him. Then there was no more sleep for her. She lay there on a bed that inexorably became a bed of ashes and hot coals, while her imagination dwelt on every conceivable disaster, from his having forsaken her for another woman, to his having somehow ended up in the morgue. And as the night faded from black to gray to daylight, the telephone began to seem another presence in the house, sitting not far from her like a great malevolent black cat that might at any moment, with one shrill cry, scatter her life like dismembered limbs all over this tiny room. There were places that she could have called, but she would have died first. After all, he had only needed to point it out once. He would never have occasion to point it out again. They were not married. Often she had pulled herself out of bed, her loins cold and her body trembling, and gotten dressed and had coffee and gone to work without seeing him. But he would call her in the office later in the day. She would have had several stiff drinks at lunch, and so could be very offhand over the phone, pretending that she had only supposed him to have gotten up a little earlier than herself that morning. But the moment she put the receiver down, she hated him. She made herself sick with fantasies of how she would be revenged. Then she hated herself, thinking into what an iron maiden of love and hatred he had placed her. She hated him even more. She could not help feeling that he treated her this way because of her color, because she was a colored girl. Then her past and her present threatened to engulf her. She knew she was being unfair. She could not help it. She thought of psychiatry. She saw herself transformed, at peace with the world, herself, her color, with the male of indeterminate color she would have found. Always this journey around her skull ended with tears, resolutions, prayers, with Paul's face, which then had the power to reconcile her even to the lowest circle of hell. After work, on the way home, she stopped for another drink, or two, or three, bought sen-sen to muffle the odor, wore the most casually glowing of smiles as he casually kissed her when she came through the door. She knew that he was going to leave her. It was in his walk, his talk, his eyes. He wanted to go. He had already moved back, crouching to leap. And she had no rival. He was not going to another woman. He simply wanted to go. It would happen today, tomorrow, 3 weeks from today. It was over. She could do nothing about it. Neither could she save herself by jumping first. She had no place to go. She only wanted him. She had tried hard to want other men, and she was still young, only 26, and there was no real lack of opportunity. But all she knew about other men was that they were not Paul. Through the gloom of the hallway he came back into the room and, moving to the edge of the bed, lit a cigarette. She smiled at him. "Good morning," she said. "Would you light one for me, too?" He looked down at her with a sleepy and slightly shamefaced grin. Without a word, he offered her his freshly lit cigarette, lit another, and then got into bed, shivering slightly. "Good morning," he said then. "Did you sleep well?" "Very well," she said lightly. "Did you? I didn't hear you come in." "Ah, I was very quiet," he said teasingly, curling his great body toward her and putting his head on her breast. "I didn't want to wake you up. I was afraid you'd hit me with something." She laughed. "What time did you come in?" "Oh," he raised his head, dragging on his cigarette, and half frowned, half smiled. "About an hour or so ago." "What did you do? Find a new after-hours joint?" "No. I ran into Cosmo. We went over to his place to look at a couple of new paintings he's done. He had a bottle. We sat around." She knew Cosmo and distrusted him. He was about 40, and he had had 2 wives. He did not think women were worth much. She was sure that Cosmo had been giving Paul advice as to how to be rid of her. She could imagine, or believed she could, how he had spoken about her. And she felt her skin tighten. At the same moment, she became aware of the warmth of Paul's body. "What did you talk about?" she asked. "Oh, painting. His paintings, my paintings, all God's children's paintings." During the day, while she was at work, Paul painted in the back room of this cramped and criminally expensive village apartment, where the light was bad, and where there was not really room enough for him to step back and look at his canvas. Most of his paintings were stored with a friend. Still, there were enough, standing against the wall piled on top of the closet and on the table, for a sizable one-man show. If they were any good, said Paul, who worked very hard. She knew this, despite the fact that he said so rather too often. She knew by his face, his distance, his quality frequently of seeming to be like a spring, unutterably dangerous to touch, and by the exhaustion, different in kind from any other, with which he sometimes stretched out in bed. She thought, of course, that his paintings were very good, but he did not take her judgment seriously. "You're sweet, funny face," he sometimes said, "but you know, You aren't really very bright." She was scarcely at all mollified by his adding, "Thank heaven! I hate bright women." She remembered now how stupid she had felt about music all the time she had lived with Arthur, a man of her own color who had played a clarinet. She was still finding out today, so many years after their breakup, how much she had learned from him. Not only about music, unluckily. "If I stay on this merry-go-round," she thought, "I'm going to become very accomplished, just the sort of girl no man will ever marry." She moved closer to Paul, the fingers of one hand playing with his hair. He lay still. He was very silent. "Ruth," he said finally, "I've been thinking." At once, she was all attention. She drew on her cigarette, her fingers still drifting through his hair, as though she were playing with water. "Yes," she prompted. She had always wondered when the moment came if she would make things easy for him or difficult. She still did not know. He leaned up on one elbow, looking down at her. She met his eyes, hoping that her own eyes reflected nothing but calm curiosity. He continued to stare at her and put one hand on her short, dark hair. Then, "You're a nice girl," he said, irrelevantly, and leaned down and kissed her. With a kiss, she thought. "My father wouldn't think so," she said, "if he could see me now. What is it you've been thinking?" He still said nothing, but only looked down at her, an expression in his eyes that she could not read. "I've been thinking," he said, "that it's about time I got started on that portrait of you. I ought to get started right away." She felt very sharply that his nerve had failed him, but she felt too that his decision now to do a portrait of her was a means of moving far enough away from her to be able to tell her the truth. Also, he had always said that he could do something wonderful with her on canvas. It would be foolish to let the opportunity pass. Cosmo had probably told him this. She had always been flattered by his desire to paint her, but now she hoped that he would suddenly go blind. "Any time," she said, and could not resist. "Am I to be part of a gallery?" "Yeah. I'll probably be able to sell you for $1,000, he said, and kissed her again. "That's not a very nice thing to say," she murmured. "You're a funny girl. What's not nice about $1,000? He leaned over her to put out his cigarette in the ashtray near the bed, then took hers and put it out too. He fell back against her and put his hand on her breast. She said tentatively, "Well, I suppose if you do it often enough, I could stop working." His arms tightened, but she did not feel that this was due entirely to desire. It might be said that he was striving now to distract her. "If I do what? Enough?" He grinned. Now, she smiled. "You just said that I was a nice girl." "You're one of the nicest girls I ever met," said Paul soberly. "Really, you are. I often wonder." "You often wonder what?" "What's going to become of you?" She felt like a river trying to run two ways at once. She felt herself shrinking from him, yet she flowed toward him too. She knew he felt it. "But as long as you're with me," she said, and she could not help herself. She felt she was about to cry. She held his face between her hands, pressing yet closer against him. "As long as you're with me." His face was white. His eyes glowed. There was a war in him too. Everything that divided them charged for an instant, the tiny space between them. Then the veils of habit and desire covered both their eyes. "Life is very long," said Paul at last. He kissed her. They both sighed, and slowly she surrendered, opening up before him like the dark continent, made mad and delirious and blind by the entry of a mortal as bright as the morning, as white as milk. When she left the house, he was sleeping. Because she was late for work and because it was raining, she dropped into a cab and was whirled out of the streets of the village, which still suggested at least some faint memory of the individual life, into the grim publicities of Midtown Manhattan. Blocks and squares and exclamation marks, stone and steel and glass as far as the eye could see, everything towering, lifting itself against, though by no means into, heaven. The people, so surrounded by heights that they had lost any sense of what heights were, rather resembled nevertheless these gray rigidities, and also resembled, in their frantic motion, people fleeing a burning town. Ruth, who was not so many years removed from trees and earth, had felt in the beginning that she would never be able to live on an island so eccentric. She had, for example, before she arrived, dreamed of herself as walking by the river. But apart from the difficulties of realizing this ambition, which were not inconsiderable, it turned out that a lone girl walking by the river was simply asking to be victimized by both the disturbers and the defenders of the public peace. She retreated into the interior, and this dream was abandoned, along with others. For her, as for most of Manhattan, trees and water ceased to be realities. The nervous, trusting landscape of the city began to be the landscape of her mind. And soon, her mind, like life on the island, seemed to be incapable of flexibility, of moving outward, could only shrink upward and into meaningless abstractions or drop downward into cruelty and confusion. She worked for a life insurance company that had only recently become sufficiently progressive to hire Negroes. This meant that she worked in an atmosphere so positively electric with interracial goodwill that no one ever dreamed of telling the truth about anything. It would have seemed, and it quite possibly would have been, a spiteful act. The only other Negro there was male, a Mr. Davis, who was very high-placed. He was an expert, it appeared, in some way about Negroes and life insurance, from which Ruth had ungenerously concluded that he was the company's expert on how to cheat more Negroes out of more money, and not only remain within the law, but also be honored with a plaque for good race relations. She often, but not always, took dictation from him, the other girls manifesting a rough, Girl Scoutish camaraderie that made the question of their sincerity archaic, found him marvelous, and wondered if he had a wife. Ruth found herself unable to pursue these strangely overheated and yet eerily impersonal speculations with anything like the indicated vehemence, since it was extremely unlikely that any of these girls would ever even go dancing with Mr. Davis. It was impossible to believe that they had any ambition to share his couch, matrimonial or otherwise, and yet, lacking this ambition, it was impossible to account for their avidity. But they were all incredibly innocent and made her ashamed of her body. At the same time, it demanded during their maddening coffee breaks a great deal of willpower not to take Paul's photograph out of her wallet and wave it before them, saying, "You'll never lay a finger on Mr. Davis, but look what I took from you." Her face at such moments allowed them to conclude that she was planning to ensnare Mr. Davis herself. It was perhaps this assumption, despite her phone calls from Paul, that allowed them to discuss Mr. Davis so freely before her, and they also felt, in an incoherent way, that these discussions were proof of their democracy. She did not find Mr. Davis marvelous, though she thought him good-looking enough, in a square, stocky, gleaming, black-boyish sort of way. Near her office, visible from her window and having the air of contraband in Caesar's marketplace, was a small gray chapel. An ugly neon cross jutted out above the heads of passers-by, proclaiming, "Jesus saves." Today, as the lunch hour approached, and she began as always to fidget, debating whether she would telephone Paul or wait for Paul to telephone her, she found herself staring in some irritation at this cross, thinking about her childhood. The telephone rang and rang, but never for her. She began to feel the need of a drink. She thought of Paul sleeping while she typed and became outraged, then thought of his painting and became maternal, thought of his arms and paused to light a cigarette, throwing the most pitying of glances toward the girl who shared her office, who still had a crush on Frank Sinatra. Nevertheless, the sublimatory tube still burning, the smoke tickling her nostrils and the typewriter bell clanging at brief intervals like signals flashing on a railroad track, she relapsed into bitterness, confusion, fury, for she was trapped. Paul was a trap. She wanted a man of her own, and she wanted children, and all she could see for herself today was a lifetime of typing while Paul slept, or a lifetime of typing with no Paul. And she began rather to envy the stocky girl with the crush on Frank Sinatra, since she would settle one day, obviously for a great deal less, and probably turn out children as Detroit turned out cars, and never sigh for an instant for what she had missed, having indeed never, and especially with a lifetime of movie-going behind her, missed anything. Jesus saves. She began to think of the days of her innocence. These days had been spent in the South, where her mother and father and older brother remained. She had an older sister, married, and with several children in Oakland, and a baby sister who had become a small-time nightclub singer in New Orleans. There were relatives of her father's living in Harlem, and she was sure that they wrote to him often complaining that she never visited them. They, like her father, were earnest churchgoers, though unlike her father their religion was strongly mixed with an opportunistic respectability, and with ambitions to better society and their own place in it, which her father would have scorned. Their ambitions vitiated in them what her father called the true religion, and what remained of this religion, which was principally vindictiveness, prevented them from understanding anything whatever about those concrete northern realities that made them at once so obsequious and so venomous. Her innocence. It was many years ago. She remembered their house, so poor and plain, standing by itself apart from other houses, as nude and fragile on the stony ground as an upturned cardboard box. And it was nearly as dark inside as it might have been beneath a box. It leaked when the rain fell, froze when the wind blew, could scarcely be entered in July. They tried to coax sustenance out of a soil that had long ago gone out of the business. As time went on, they grew to depend less and less on the soil, and more on the oyster boats, and on the wages and leftovers brought home by their mother, and then herself, from the white kitchens in town. And her mother still struggled in these white kitchens, humming sweet hymns, tiny, mild-eyed and bent. Her father still labored on the oyster boats. After a lifetime of labor, should they drop dead tomorrow, there would not be a penny for their burial clothes. Her brother, still unmarried, nearing 30 now, loitered through the town with his dangerous reputation, drinking and living off the women he murdered with his love-making. He made her parents fearful, but they reiterated in every letter that they had placed him and all their children in the hands of God. Ruth opened each letter in guilt and fear, expecting each time to be confronted with the catastrophe that had at last overtaken her kin, anticipating, too, with a selfish annoyance that added to her guilt, the enforced and necessary journey back to her home in mourning. The survivors gathered together to do brief honor to the dead, whose death was certainly in part attributable to the indifference of the living. She often wrote to her brother asking him to come north, and asked her sister in Oakland to second her in this plea. But she knew that he would not come north because of her. She had shamed him and embittered him. She was one of the reasons he drank. Her mother's song, which she doubtless still hummed each evening as she walked the old streets homeward, began with the question, "How did you feel when you come out of the wilderness?" And she remembered her mother half humming, half singing, with a steady, tense beat that would make any blues singer sit up and listen, though she thought it best not to say this to her mother. Come out of the wilderness. Come out of the wilderness. How did you feel when you come out of the wilderness? Leaning on the Lord. And the answers were many. Oh, my soul felt happy, or I shouted hallelujah, or I do thank God. Ruth finished her cigarette, looking out over the stone-cold, hideous New York streets, and thought with a strange new pain of her mother. Her mother had once been no older than Ruth was today. She had probably been pretty. She had also wept and trembled and cried beneath the rude thrusting that was her master and her life. And children had knocked in her womb and split her as they came crying out and into the wilderness. She had placed them in the hands of God. She had known nothing but labor and sorrow, and she had had to confront every day of her life the everlasting, nagging, infinitesimal details. It had clearly all come to nothing. How could she be singing still? Jesus saves. She put out her cigarette, and a sense of loss and disaster wavered through her like a mist. She wished in that moment from the bottom of her heart that she had never left home. She wished that she had never met Paul. She wished that she had never been touched by his whiteness. She should have found a great, slow black man full of laughter and sighs and grace. A man at whose center there burned a steady, smokeless fire. She should have surrendered to him and been a woman and had his children, and found, through being irreplaceable, despite whatever shadows life might cast, peace that would enable her to endure. She had left home practically by accident. It had been partly due to her brother. He had grown too accustomed to thinking of her as his prized, adored little sister to recognize the changes that were occurring within her. This had had something to do with the fact that his own sexual coming of age had disturbed his peace with her. He would, in good faith, have denied this, which did not make it less true. When she was 17, her brother had surprised her alone in a barn with a boy. Nothing had taken place between herself and this boy, though there was no saying what might not have happened if her brother had not come in. She, guilty though she was in everything but the act, could scarcely believe and had not until today ever quite forgiven his immediate leap to the obvious conclusion. She began screaming before he hit her. Her father had had to come running to pull her brother off the boy, and she had shouted their innocence in a steadily blackening despair, for the boy was too badly beaten to be able to speak, and it was clear that no one believed her. She bawled at last, "God damn it, I wish I had! I wish I had! I might as well have done it!" Her father slapped her. Her brother gave her a look and said, "You dirty, you black and dirty." Then her mother had had to step between her father and her brother. She turned and ran and sat down for a long time in the darkness on a hillside by herself, shivering. And she felt dirty. She felt that nothing would ever make her clean. After this, she and her brother scarcely spoke. He had wounded her so deeply she could not face his eyes. Her father dragged her to church to make her cry repentance, but she was as stubborn as her father. She told him that she had nothing to repent, and she avoided them all, which was exactly the most dangerous thing that could have happened. For when she met the musician Arthur, who was more than 20 years older than she ran away to New York with him. She lived with him for more than 4 years. She did not love him all that time. She simply did not know how to escape his domination. He had never made the big time himself, and he therefore wanted her to become a singer. And perhaps she had ceased to love him when it became clear that she had no talent whatever. He was disappointed, but he was also very proud, and he made her go to school to study shorthand and typing, and made her self-conscious about her accent and her grammar, and took great delight in dressing her. Through him, she got over feeling that she was black and unattractive. And as soon as this happened, she was able to leave him. In fleeing Harlem and her relatives there, she drifted downtown to the Village, where eventually she found employment as a waitress in one of those restaurants with candles on the tables. Here, after a year or so and several increasingly disastrous and desperate liaisons, she met Paul. The telephone rang several desks away from her, and at the same instant she was informed that Mr. Davis wanted her in his office. She was sure that it was Paul telephoning, but she picked up her pad and walked into Mr. Davis's cubbyhole. Someone picked up the receiver, cutting off the bell, and she closed the door of Mr. Davis's office behind her. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he answered. He looked out of his window. "Though between you and me, I've seen better mornings. This morning ain't half trying." They both laughed, self-consciously amused and relieved by his ain't. She sat down, her pencil poised, looking at him questioningly. "How do you like your job?" he asked her. She had not expected his question, which she immediately distrusted and resented, suspecting him on no evidence whatever of acting now as a company spy. "It's quite pleasant," she said in a guarded, ladylike tone, and stared hypnotically at him, as though she believed that he was about to do her mischief by magical means, and she had to resist his spell. "Are you intending to be a career girl?" He was giving her more attention this morning than he ever had before, with the result that she found herself reciprocating. A tentative friendliness wavered in the air between them. She smiled. "I guess I ought to say that it depends on my luck." He laughed, perhaps rather too uproariously, though more probably she had merely grown unaccustomed to his kind of laughter. Her brother bobbed briefly to the surface of her mind. "Well," he said, "does your luck seem likely to take you out of this office any time in the near future?" "No," she said, "it certainly doesn't look that way." And they laughed again, but she wondered if he would be laughing if he knew about Paul. "If you don't mind me saying so, then," he said, "I'm lucky." He quickly riffled through some papers on his desk, putting on a business air as rakishly as she had seen him put on his hat. "There's going to be some changes made around here. I reckon you have heard that." He grinned. Then briskly, "I'm going to be needing a secretary. Would you like it? You get a raise." He coughed. "In salary, of course." "Why, I'd love it," she heard herself saying before she had time for the bitter reflection that this professional advance probably represented the absolute extent of her luck. And she was ashamed of the thought, which she could not repress, that Paul would probably hang on a little longer if he knew she was making more money. She resolved not to tell him, and wondered how many hours this resolution would last. Mr. Davis looked at her with an intentness almost personal. There was a strained, brief silence. "Good," he said at last. "There are a few details to be worked out, like getting me more office space." They both smiled. "But you'll be hearing directly in a few days. I only wanted to sound you out first." He rose and held out his hand. "I hope you're going to like working with me," he said. "I think I'm going to like working with you." She rose and shook his hand, bewildered to find that something in his simplicity had touched her very deeply. "I'm sure I will," she said gravely. "And thank you very much." She reached backward for the doorknob. "Miss Bowman," he said sharply and paused. "Well, if I were you, I wouldn't mention it yet to—" He waved his hand uncomfortably. "The girls out there." Now he really did look rather boyish. "It looks better if it comes from the front office." "I understand," she said quickly. "Also, I didn't ask for you out of any racial consideration," he said. "You just seemed the most sensible girl available." "I understand," she repeated. They were both trying not to smile. "And thank you again." She closed the door of his office behind her. "A man called you," said the stocky girl. "He said he'd call back." "Thank you," Ruth said. She could see that the girl wanted to talk, so she busily studied some papers on her desk and retired behind the noise of her typewriter. The stocky girl had gone out to lunch, and Ruth was reluctantly deciding that she might as well go too when Paul called again. "Hello? How's it going up there?" "Dull. How are things down there? Are you out of bed already?" "What do you mean, already?" He sounded slightly nettled and was trying not to sound that way, the almost certain signal that a storm was coming. "It's nearly 1 o'clock. I got work to do too, you know." "Yes, I know." But neither could she quite keep the sardonic edge out of her voice. There was a silence. "You coming straight home from work?" "Yes. Will you be there?" "Yeah. I gotta go uptown with Cosmo this afternoon, talk to some gallery guy. Cosmo thinks he might like my stuff." "Oh," thinking, "Damn Cosmo. That's wonderful, Paul. I hope something comes of it." Nothing whatever would come of it. The gallery owner would be evasive, if he existed, if they ever got to his gallery, and then Paul and Cosmo would get drunk. She would hear, while she ached to be free, to be anywhere else, with anyone else, from Paul, all about how stupid art dealers were, how incestuous the art world had become, how impossible it was to do anything. His eyes meanwhile focusing with a drunken intensity, his eyes at once arrogant and defensive. Well, most of what he said was true, and she knew it. It was not his fault. Not his fault. "Yeah, I sure hope so. I thought I'd take up some of my watercolors, some small sketches, you know. All the most obvious things I've got." This policy did not empirically seem to be as foolproof as everyone believed, but she did not know how to put her uncertain objections into words. "That sounds good. What time have you got to be there?" "Around 3. I'm meeting Cosmo now for lunch." "Oh," lightly. "Why don't you two, just this once, order your lunch before you order your cocktails?" He laughed, too, and was clearly no more amused than she. "Well, Cosmo'll be buying. He'll have to, so I guess I'll leave it up to him to order." Touché. Her hand holding the receiver shook. "Well, I hope you two make it to the gallery without falling flat on your faces." "Don't worry." Then in a rush, she recognized the tone before she understood the words. It was his "you can't say I haven't been honest with you" tone. "Cosmo says the gallery owner's got a daughter." "I hope to God she marries you," she thought. "I hope she marries you and takes you off to Istanbul forever, where I will never have to hear you again, so I can get a breath of air, so I can get out from under." They both laughed, a laugh conspiratorial and sophisticated, like the whispered whiskey laughter of a couple in a nightclub. "Oh," she said, "is she pretty?" "She's probably a pig. She's had 2 husbands already. Both artists." She laughed again. "Where has she buried the bodies?" "Well," really amused this time, but also rather grim, "one of them ended up in the booby hatch, and the other turned into a fairy and was last seen dancing with some soldiers in Majorca." Now they laughed together, and the wires between them hummed, almost with the stormless friendship they both hoped to feel for each other someday. "A powerful pig. Maybe you better have a few drinks. You see what I mean? But Cosmo says she's not such a fool about painting. She doesn't seem to have much luck with painters. Maybe you'll break the jinx." "Maybe. Wish me luck. It sure would be nice to unload some of my stuff on somebody." "You're doing just fine," she thought. "Will you call me later?" "Yeah, around 3:30, 4 o'clock as soon as I get away from there." "Right. Be good." "You too. Goodbye." "Goodbye." She put down the receiver, still amused and still trembling. After all, he had called her. But he would probably not have called her if he were not actually nourishing the hope that the gallery owner's daughter might find him interesting. In that case, he would have to tell Ruth about her, and it was better to have the way prepared. Paul was always preparing the way for one unlikely exploit or flight or another. It was the reason he told Ruth everything. To tell everything is a very effective means of keeping secrets. Secrets hidden at the heart of midnight are simply waiting to be dragged to the light, as on some unlucky high noon they always are. But secrets shrouded in the glare of candor are bound to defeat even the most determined and agile inspector. For the light is always changing and proves that the eye cannot be trusted. So Ruth knew about Paul nearly all there was to know, knew him better than anyone else on earth ever had or probably ever would. Only she did not know him well enough to stop him from being Paul. While she was waiting for the elevator, she realized with mild astonishment that she was actually hoping that the gallery owner's daughter would take Paul away. This hope resembled the desperation of someone suffering from a toothache who, in order to bring the toothache to an end, was almost willing to jump out of a window. But she found herself wondering if love really ought to be like a toothache. Love ought. She stepped out of the elevator, really wondering for a moment which way to turn, to be a means of being released from guilt and terror. But Paul's touch would never release her. He had power over her not because she was free, but because she was guilty. To enforce his power over her, he had only to keep her guilt awake. This did not demand malice on his part. It scarcely demanded perception. It only demanded that he have, as in fact he overwhelmingly did have, an instinct for his own convenience. His touch, which should have raised her, lifted her roughly only to throw her down hard. Whenever he touched her, she became blacker and dirtier than ever. The loneliest place under heaven was in Paul's arms. And yet, she went into his arms with such eagerness and such hope. She had once thought herself happy. Was this because she had been proud that he was white? But it was she who was insisting on these colors. Her blackness was not Paul's fault. Neither was her guilt. She was punishing herself for something, a crime she could not remember. You dirty. You black and dirty. She bumped into someone as she passed the cigar stand in the lobby, and looking up to murmur, "Excuse me," recognized Mr. Davis. He was stuffing cigars into his breast pocket, though the gesture was rather like that of a small boy stuffing his pockets with cookies. She was immediately certain that they were among the most expensive cigars that could be bought. She wondered what he spent on his clothes. It looked like a great deal. From the crown of his rakishly tilted, deafeningly conservative hat to the tips of his astutely dulled shoes, he glowed with a very vindictive sharpness. There were no flies on Mr. Davis. He would always be the best-dressed man in anybody's lobby. He was just about the last person she wanted to see. But perhaps his lunch hour was over and he was coming in. "Miss Bowman!" He gave her a delighted grin. "Are you just going to lunch?" He made her want to laugh. There was something so incongruous about finding that grin behind all that manner and under all those clothes. "Yes," she said. "I guess you've had your lunch." "No, I ain't had no lunch," he said. "I'm hungry just like you." He paused. "I'd be delighted to have your company, Miss Bowman." Very courtly, she thought, amused, and the smile is extremely wicked. Then she realized that she was pleased that a man was being courtly with her, even if only for an instant in a crowded lobby, and at the same instant made the discovery that what was so widely referred to as a wicked smile was really only the smile scarcely ever to be encountered any more, of a man who was not afraid of women. She thought it safe to demur. "Please don't think you have to be polite." "I'm never polite about food," he told her. "Almost drove my mama crazy." He took her arm. "I know a right nice place nearby." His stride and his accent made her think of home. She also realized that he, like many Negroes of his uneasily rising generation, kept in touch, so to speak, with himself by deliberately affecting whenever possible the illiterate speech of his youth. "We going to get on real well, you'll see. Time you get through being my secretary, you likely to end up with Alcoholics Anonymous." He took her arm. "I know a right nice place nearby." His stride and accent made her think of home. The place nearby turned out to be a short taxi ride away, but it was, as he had said, right nice. She doubted that Mr. Davis could possibly eat there every day, though it was clear that he was a man who liked to spend money. She ordered a dry martini, and he a bourbon on the rocks. He professed himself astonished that she knew what a dry martini was. "I thought you was a country girl." "I am a country girl," she said. No, he said. "No more. You a country girl who came to the city, and that's the dangerous kind. Don't know if it's safe having you for my secretary." Underneath all his chatter, she felt him watching her, sizing her up. "Are you afraid your wife will object?" she asked. "You ought to be able to look at me," he said, "and tell that I ain't got a wife." She laughed. "So you're not married? I wonder if I should tell the girls in the office." "I don't care what you tell them," he said. "Then, how do you get along with them?" "We get along fine," she said. "We don't have much to talk about except whether or not you're married, but that'll probably last until you do get married, and then we can talk about your wife." But thinking, "For God's sake, let's get off this subject," she added before he could say anything, "You called me a country girl. Aren't you a country boy?" "I am," he said, "but I didn't change my drinking habits when I came north. If bourbon was good enough for me down yonder, it's good enough for me up here." "I didn't have any drinking habits to change, Mr. Davis," she told him. "I was too young to be drinking when I left home." His eyes were slightly questioning, but he held his peace, while she wished that she had held hers. She concentrated on sipping her martini, suddenly remembering that she was sitting opposite a man who knew more about why girls left home than could be learned from locker-room stories. She wondered if he had a sister, and tried to be amused at finding herself still so incorrigibly old-fashioned. But he did not really seem to be much like her brother. She met his eyes again. "Where I come from," he said with a smile, "nobody was too young to be drinking. Toughen them up for later life." And he laughed. By the time lunch was over, she had learned that he was from a small town in Alabama, was the youngest of 3 sons but had no sisters, had gone to college in Tennessee, was a reserve officer in the Air Force. He was 32. His mother was living. His father was dead. He had lived in New York for 2 years, but was beginning now to like it less than he had in the beginning. "At first," he said, "I thought it would be fun to live in a city where didn't nobody know you and you didn't know nobody, and where looked like you could do anything you was big and black enough to do. But you get tired not knowing nobody, and there ain't really that many things you want to do alone." "Oh, but you must have friends," she said. "Uptown? I don't live uptown. I live in Brooklyn. Ain't nobody in Brooklyn got friends." She laughed with him, but distrusted the turn the conversation was taking. They were walking back to the office. He walked slowly, as though in deliberate opposition to the people around them, although they were already a little late. At least she was late. But since she was with one of her superiors, it possibly didn't matter. "Where do you live?" he asked her. "Do you live uptown?" "No," she said. "I live downtown on Bank Street." And after a moment, "That's in the village. Greenwich Village." He grinned. "Don't tell me you studying to be a writer or a dancer or something." "No, I just found myself there. It used to be cheap." He scowled. "Ain't nothing cheap in this town no more. Not even the necessities." His tone made clear to which necessities he referred, and she would have loved to tease him a little, just to watch him laugh. But she was beginning, with every step they took, to be a little afraid of him. She was responding to him with parts of herself that had been buried so long she had forgotten they existed. In his office that morning, when he shook her hand, she had suddenly felt a warmth of affection, of nostalgia, of gratitude even. And again, in the lobby, he had somehow made her feel safe. It was his friendliness that was so unsettling. She had grown used to unfriendly people. Still, she did not want to be friends with him. Still less did she desire that their friendship should ever become anything more. Sooner or later he would learn about Paul. He would look at her differently then. It would not be so much because of Paul as a man, perhaps not even Paul as a white man, but it would make him bitter. It would make her ashamed for him to see how she was letting herself be wasted for Paul, who did not love her. This was the reason she was ashamed and wished to avoid the scrutiny of Mr. Davis. She was doing something to herself out of shame that he would be right to find indefensible. She was punishing herself. For what? She looked sideways at his black Sambo profile under the handsome lightweight Dobbs hat and wished that she could tell him about it, that he would turn his head, holding it slightly to one side, and watch her with those eyes that had seen and that had learned to hide so much. Eyes that had seen so many girls like her taken beyond the hope of rescue, while all the owner of the eyes could do. Perhaps she wore Paul the way Mr. Davis wore his hat. And she looked away from him, half smiling and yet near tears, over the furious streets on which here and there, like a design, colored people also hurried, thinking, "And we were slaves here once." "Do you like music?" he said abruptly. "I don't necessarily mean Carnegie Hall." Now was the time to stop him. She had only to say, "Mr. Davis, I'm living with someone." It would not be necessary to say anything more than that. She met his eyes. "Of course I like music," she said faintly. "Well, I know a place I'd like to take you one of these evenings after work. Not going to be easy being my secretary." His smile forced her to smile with him. "But, Mr. Davis," she said, and stopped. They were before the entrance to their office building. "What's the matter?" he asked. "You forget something?" "No." She looked down, feeling big, black, and foolish. "Mr. Davis," she said, "you don't know anything about me." "You don't know anything about me either," he said. "That's not what I mean," she said. He sounded slightly angry. "I ain't asked you nothing yet," he said. "Why can't you wait till you're asked?" "Well," she stammered, "it may be too late by then." They stared hard at each other for a moment. "Well," he said, "if it turns out to be too late, won't be nobody to blame but me, will it?" She stared at him again, almost hating him. She blindly felt that he had no right to do this to her, to cause her to feel such a leap of hope, if he was only in the end going to give her back all her shame. "You know what they say down home," she said slowly. "If you don't know what you doing, you better ask somebody." There were tears in her eyes. He took her arm. "Come on in this house, girl," he said. "We got insurance to sell." They said nothing to each other in the elevator on the way upstairs. She wanted to laugh, and she wanted to cry. He ostentatiously did not watch her. He stood next to her, humming "Rocks in My Bed." She waited all afternoon for Paul to telephone, but although perversely enough, the phone seemed never to cease ringing, it never rang for her. At 5:15, just before she left the office, she called the apartment. Paul was not there. She went downstairs to a nearby bar and ordered a drink, and called again at 5:45. He was not there. She resolved to have one more drink and leave this bar, which she did, wandering a few blocks north to a bar frequented by theater people. She sat in a booth and ordered a drink, and at 6:45 called again. He was not there. She was in a reckless, desperate state like flight. She knew that she could not possibly go home and cook supper and wait in the empty apartment until his key turned in the lock. He would come in breathless and contrite, or else truculently not contrite, probably a little drunk, probably quite hungry. He would tell her where he had been and what he had been doing. Whatever he told her would probably be true. There are so many ways of telling the truth. And whether it was true or not did not matter, and she would not be able to reproach him for the one thing that did matter, that he had left her sitting in the house alone. She could not make this reproach because, after all, leaving women sitting around in empty houses had been the specialty of all men for ages. And for ages, when the men arrived, women bestirred themselves to cook supper. Luckily, it was not yet common knowledge that many a woman had narrowly avoided committing murder by calmly breaking a few eggs. She wondered where it had all gone to. The ease, the pleasure they had had together once. At one time, their evenings together sitting around the house, drinking beer or reading or simply laughing and talking, had been the best part of all their days. Paul, reading or walking about with a can of beer in his hand, talking, gesturing, scratching his chest. Paul, stretched out on the sofa, staring at the ceiling. Paul, cheerful with that low-down cavernous chuckle and that foolish grin. Paul, grim, with his mouth turned down and his eyes burning. Paul doing anything whatever. Paul with his eyelids sealed in sleep, drooling and snoring. Paul lighting her cigarette, touching her elbow, talking in his million ways to her, had been the light that lighted up her world. Now it was all gone. It would never come again, and that face, which was like the heavens, was darkening against her. These present days, after supper, when the chatter each used as a cover began to show dangerous signs of growing thinner, there would be no choice but sleep. She might indeed have preferred a late movie or a round of the bars, lights, noise, other people, but this would scarcely be Paul's desire, already tired from his day. Besides, after all, she had to face the office in the morning. Eventually, therefore, bed. Perhaps he or she or both of them might read a while. Perhaps there would take place between them what had sometimes been described as the act of love. Then sleep. Black and dreadful like a drugged state from which she would be rescued by the scream of the alarm clock or the realization that Paul was no longer in bed. Ah. Her throat ached with tears of fury and despair. In the days before she had met Paul, men had taken her out. She had laughed a lot. She had been young. She had not wished to spend her life protecting herself with laughter against men she cared nothing about. But she could not go on like this, either, drinking in random bars because she was afraid to go home. Neither could she guess what life might bring her when Paul was gone. She wished that she had never met him. She wished that he or she or both of them were dead, and for a moment she really wished it, with a violence that frightened her. Perhaps there was always murder at the very heart of love. The strong desire to murder the beloved, so that one could at last be assured of privacy and peace, and be as safe and unchanging as the grave. Perhaps this was why disasters thicker and more malevolent than bees circled Paul's head whenever he was out of her sight. Perhaps in those moments when she had believed herself willing to lay down her life for him, she had only been presenting herself with a metaphor for her peace. His death which would be an inadequate revenge for the color of his skin, for his failure by not loving her to release her from the prison of her own. The waitress passed her table, and Ruth ordered another drink. After this drink she would go. The bar was beginning to fill up, mostly, as she judged, with theater people, some of them possibly on their way to work, most of them drawn here by habit and hope. For the past few moments, without realizing it, she had been watching a lean, pale boy at the bar whose curly hair leaned electrically over his forehead like a living, awry crown. Something about him, his stance, his profile, or his grin, prodded painfully at her attention. But it was not that he reminded her of Paul. He reminded her of a boy she had known briefly a few years ago, a very lonely boy who was now a merchant seaman, Probably, wherever he might be on the globe at this moment, whoring his unbearably unrealized, mysteriously painful life away. She had been fond of him, but loneliness in him had been like a cancer. It had really unfitted him for human intercourse, and she had not been sorry to see him go. She had not thought of him for years. Yet now, the stranger at the bar, whom she was beginning to recognize as an actor of brief but growing reputation, abruptly brought him back to her. Brought him back encrusted, as it were, with the anguish of the intervening years. She remembered things she thought she had forgotten, and wished that she had been wiser then. Then she smiled at herself, wishing she were wiser now. Once, when he had done something to hurt her, she had told him, trying to be calm but choked and trembling with rage, "Look, this is the 20th century. We're not down on the plantation. You're not the master's son, and I'm not the black girl you can just sleep with when you want to and kick about as you please." His face then had held something. Held many things. Bitterness, amusement, fury. But the startling element was pain. His pain, with which she now invested the face of the actor at the bar. It made her wish that she had held her tongue. "Well," he said at last, "I guess I'll get on back to the big house and leave you down here with the pickaninnies." They had seen each other a few times thereafter, but that was really the evening on which everything had ended between them. She wondered if that boy had ever found a home. The actor at the bar looked toward her briefly, but she knew he was not seeing her. He looked at his watch, frowned. She saw that he was not as young as he looked. He ordered another drink and looked downward, leaning both elbows on the bar. The dim lights played on his crown of hair. He moved his head slightly with impatience upward, his mouth slightly open. And in that instant, somehow his profile was burned into her mind. He reminded her then of Paul, of the vanished boy, of others she had seen and never touched, of an army of boys, boys forever. An army she feared and hated and loved. In that gesture, that look upward with the light so briefly on his face, she saw the bones that held his face together, and the sorrow beginning to corrode his brow, the blood beating like butterfly wings against the cage of his heavy neck. But there was no name for something blind, cruel, lustful, lost, intolerably vulnerable in his eyes and mouth. She knew that in spite of everything, his color, his power, or his coming fame, he was lost. He did not know what had happened to his life, and he never would. This was the pain she had seen on the face of that boy so long ago, and it was this that had driven Paul into her arms and now away. The sons of the masters were roaming the world looking for arms to hold them, and the arms that might have held them could not forgive. A sound escaped her. She was astonished to realize it was a sob. The waitress looked at her sharply. Ruth put some money on the table and hurried out. It was dark now, and the rain that had been falling intermittently all day spangled the air and glittered all over the streets. It fell against her face and mingled with her tears, and she walked briskly through the crowds to hide from them and from herself the fact that she did not know where she was going.